This interactive presentation on shadow work explores how the unconscious can rise up within us, undermining our intentions, and how it plays out between us, disrupting relationships through recurring conflicts, criticism, distance, projections, addictions, and life transitions. We'll consider why the shadow takes shape in childhood, how to recognize it in the present, and how to cultivate a conscious relationship with it, unlocking the freedom to choose new outcomes. We hope you enjoy the talk.
It is a wonderful pleasure to introduce Connie Zweig, and she's actually what I would say a pioneer in contemporary shadow work and one of the most insightful voices in modern depth psychology. As I mentioned before, many of you may know her as the co-author of Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow, books that really have, I think, helped bring Jung's concept of shadow work into collective consciousness and into the landscape of everyday life. And across her rather long and extinguished career as a Jungian analyst, writer and teacher, Connie has helped countless people recognize how the unconscious moves through us, sometimes as a quiet whisper, other times as a force that overturns our best intentions. And her later works include The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Raw to Soul, as was mentioned just a little earlier. And this extends the inquiry into the second half of life, where Connie invites us to meet the shadow of aging itself and to rediscover beneath it a profound power and spiritual unfolding. Her most recent book, Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, The Dance of Darkness and Light in Our Search for Awakening, turns its gaze towards the intersection of psychology and spirituality, illuminating how even our yearning for the light can cast a shadow. But Connie reminds us, thankfully, that inner work is not about perfection, but about presence, about cultivating a conscious relationship with what we would rather turn away from, and discovering the freedom that comes with seeing ourselves whole. So please do join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Connie Zweig. Thank you.
Renee, what a lovely introduction. Thank you.
Oh, very welcome.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you, everyone, for showing up to meet your shadow today. I know it's evening in London for a lot of you, and it's morning here. So wherever you are, we're going to take this journey together for an hour and a half. And some of you will be very familiar with shadow work, and for some of you, it might be a bit newer. So I am going to start by defining terms and the framework and so forth, and then hopefully, and I'm going to focus on relationships because that's what Renee and I decided. And then hopefully those of you who are more familiar with Jung in the Shadow will be able to learn this practice well enough to take it home with you. And there will be the recording. Renee, will that be available to the participants?
Absolutely, yes. So
Okay.
Participants can have a recording if they'd like. I'm happy to send that to everybody.
So that's great because in 90 minutes, there's a lot to cover, and the shadow is elusive. So when you want to follow up, you'll be able to do that. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. We didn't get to do a tech check, but I think it'll be okay.
We can hear you fine, and you can share. Are you fantastic?
And I want to mention that I can't see the chat while I'm doing the PowerPoint, but you're welcome to post, and we'll have time for a conversation when I'm done for your questions and comments. So I'm going to go through this for a while, and I'm going to ask you to have a paper and pencil handy because we're going to pause to reflect and do your own shadow work. And it's much nicer not to do it on a device, but to have paper and pen by your side. And I'm not going to take questions during the presentation, but as I say, we'll do that afterwards. Okay, so here we go. I'm glad we're starting a little early. We can take advantage of these 10 minutes. So some of you I know are familiar with the shadow and others maybe not. So I am going to start with some really basic description of the framework and also my method as it was developed in Romancing the Shadow. I'm going to present material to you and then I'm going to pause a number of times for you to write your own responses to my prompts. Okay, so the shadow is slippery. That's really the first thing to say about it. Its nature is to hide. So if you don't follow me the first time, I'm going to be repeating the process several times. It's not easy to look at a blind spot in our awareness. So be patient with yourself, please. And by the end, I'm hoping you'll be able to continue this practice at home. So let's begin with a story. In Oscar Wilde's only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, the central character, Dorian, a beautiful and vain young man in 19th century England, sees a painting of himself that's without a blemish, and he's handsome and appealing. And so he desires to remain youthful and perfect forever, with no sign of imperfection or aging on his face. And so to this end, he makes a pact with the devil. All signs of his degeneration, his greed, his cruelty would from then on appear on the painting and not on his face. The painting gets hidden away in a closet and it's never to be seen by anyone. But from time to time, his curiosity gets the best of him and he pulls the picture out of the darkness and takes a quick glance only to see the youthful face growing more and more unattractive. Each of us is like Dorian Gray. We seek to present a beautiful, innocent face to the world, a kind, courteous demeanor, a youthful, intelligent image. And so we push away the qualities that don't fit that image, that don't enhance our self-esteem or bring us shame and make us feel small. We shove into the dark cavern of the unconscious those feelings that make us uneasy: hatred, rage, jealousy, racism, greed, lust, and the behaviors that are deemed wrong by the culture, like addiction, laziness, aggression, dependency. And that's how we create shadow content. Like Dorian's painting, those qualities ultimately take on a life of their own, forming an invisible twin that lives just behind our life or just beside it, but as distinct from the one we know as a stranger. And the stranger, known as the shadow, is us, yet is not us. Hidden from awareness, it's not part of our conscious self-image, and so it seems to appear abruptly out of nowhere when it erupts in a range of behaviors, whether off-color jokes or abuse or addiction or criticism. And when it emerges, it feels like an unwanted stranger, leaving us ashamed and mortified. So here's your first self-reflection. Take a couple minutes and contemplate these questions and see if you can respond quickly without editing before your mind kicks in. When you hear the word shadow, what are your first associations? Quickly. Do you have a shadow, and what will happen if someone sees it? And how are you like Dorian Gray? So personal shadow is a term coined by the eminent psychiatrist Carl Jung to refer to the personal unconscious. The shadow develops in each of us as children as we identify with socially acceptable traits, like whatever they are in your family and your culture. It could be politeness, generosity, caretaking, in order to find love and acceptance from adults. And in this way, we form a conscious ego and we banish the opposite traits like rudeness, stinginess, self-centeredness, and so on into the unconscious shadow. And so the ego and shadow develop in tandem, and each is reinforced by the messages and even the glances of parents, teachers, clergy, and friends when we try to gain love and approval. If our sadness is shamed, it's exiled into the shadow. I know for me, my father didn't want me to look sad because it made him feel like a failure. If our anger is punished, it's banished too. Many parents are really uncomfortable when their kids start expressing anger because of their own issues. But it's not all, quote, negative material. If our musical or artistic talent is dismissed, it gets buried in the shadow. In other words, if you have a particular gift or aptitude that's devalued and not encouraged to develop, that too will get repressed. The great poet Robert Bly liked to say that when we were 1 or 2 years old, we had a 360-degree personality, and energy radiated out from our bodies and minds like a living globe of energy. And one day we notice that our parents don't like a part of that ball. And they say, "Can't you be still? It isn't nice to hit your brother." So behind us, we carry an invisible bag. And the parts of us that our parents didn't like get shoved into the bag. And by the time we went to school, the bag was growing large. And the teacher said, "Good kids don't get angry." So our anger went into the bag and we became nice. And our bag was growing longer. And in high school, we did a lot of bag stuffing to be accepted by our peers. Maybe we stuffed our intelligence to be with the athletes. Or we stuffed our athletic gifts to be with the honor students. And as Robert Bly said, by the time we're 20, we only have a slice of that globe left. And then we meet a woman who has her thin slice, or a man with his thin slice. And we marry thinking we know the person, even though there are huge parts of her and of ourselves in the bag. And so we spend the first part of our lives stuffing the bag, And the rest of our lives trying to get everything out again. That's shadow work. So here's your second self-reflection. Take a moment and identify the family feelings, attitudes, and behaviors that shaped your conscious identity. And then identify the family feelings, attitudes, and behaviors that were forbidden, taboo, sinful, and repressed. Identify the sources of those messages and the strategies that they used to control you or shame you or limit you. Did they make direct statements like big boys don't cry? We don't say that in our family. God will punish you. Did they use the threat of punishment or actual physical punishment? Did they use shame or reinforcement? Or maybe they modeled an open expression of feelings and opinions, and you were one of the lucky ones. So our first response to the emergence of a shadow is typically denial. We deny that our comment was cruel. We deny that a dream means anything. It's just a dream. I would never do that. We deny that a mood will last, like it's just a fleeting feeling. It's not important. We deny that a behavior is us. I'm not really critical, or I'm not a thief. That was a mistake. I'm not an addict. That was the last time. We deny a projection. That person really is lazy or seductive. And the denial leads to distraction or dismissal, so we miss the message encoded by the emergence of the shadow. We fail to learn about ourselves and move toward a more conscious relationship with the unconscious. That's why we need to quiet our minds and center ourselves to meet the shadow, so we can catch a glimpse as it erupts and then disappears again. When I was in clinical practice, I always taught my clients a meditation practice to prepare to do shadow work. To face a difficult, uncomfortable, or denied part of ourselves, we need to prepare. And we can do this with a centering practice of your choice by creating a quiet mind, an internal refuge that we can return to again and again. So you can use belly breathing or mindfulness or a mantra or a prayer. And as you calm your mind and your body, you can begin to shift your conscious attention toward your unconscious process and notice when a shadow character is erupting. When you're triggered, you can ask yourself, is that my shadow? And this is about beginning to do self-observation all day long, if you can. You can begin to learn how to focus on what is arising in your mind, where your attention is going, and learn so much about yourself as you do this kind of ongoing practice of self-observation. So in the beginning, it's about cultivating this new habit of watching, noticing your mind. And I'll explain further why we want to do that. So, as we were saying, the shadow is formed through repression, unknowingly stuffing unacceptable, forbidden, taboo feelings and behaviors into the unconscious, where they build charge and then erupt later. We meet the shadow, in fact, in small eruptions every day. When we feel possessed by a mood or an action that we can't control, depression, anxiety, rage, jealousy. When we feel humiliated by an unacceptable part of ourselves, the liar, the miser, the couch potato, the addict, the thief. And at these times, we feel as if our conscious intentions are crossed by an unknown opponent that cannot be tamed. That's a meeting with the shadow. You have this conscious intention, you're moving along to complete a project, and you start procrastinating, and you can't stop procrastinating. Something is emerging from the unconscious that has a message for you. And we meet the shadow in projection when we unknowingly attribute to others a quality that we can't stand in ourselves. He's so stupid, or she's so lazy. And we meet the shadow in transitions like midlife and retirement, when we notice unexpected fantasies and buried parts of ourselves emerge. Jung called this the unlived life. And of course, we meet the shadow in our dreams, when a part of us acts out in destructive ways that we would never do in our waking life. And yet, it's us, it's our dream. The dreamer is acting it out. So the aim of meeting the shadow consciously is to develop an ongoing relationship with it and reclaim a fuller range of feeling and action, and also gain insight into its deeper message. So again, the nature of the shadow is to hide. It's outside of the light of awareness. And so we quickly deny it. But we can catch it in a moment if we tune into it, if we use self-observation to watch. Oh, that's a sarcastic remark I made. Oh, maybe I'm in a projection and my response to this stranger is so exaggerated. Maybe she's really not like that. And quickly, the shadow character recedes back behind the curtain. And most people just let it go and move on. But with shadow work, we can invite it back out into the light of awareness. And this process of slowly bringing the shadow into awareness, shedding light on it, forgetting and remembering it again, is the nature of shadow work. And eventually we can learn to create a conscious relationship with a tiny piece of our shadow, what I call a shadow character. And we can reduce its power to unconsciously sabotage us. Our psyches are not a solid unified front surrounded by a Teflon wall. They're dynamic, fluid worlds populated by many inner characters that come and go moment to moment. A friend of mine calls it his committee. And this changes our moods and attitudes and needs. And during these shifts, we may feel as if we're possessed by a single character, while the other parts remain off stage. While one particular part acts out, it may not feel like me at all. These shadow characters arise from the unconscious with a personal history and a wound to bear and a gift to give. The more unconscious the character, the more tightly it holds onto center stage, leading us to feel and act in self-sabotaging ways. But as we begin to make them conscious and build a relationship with them, their grasp loosens and our range of choice expands. And eventually we can offer our shadow characters a place in our psyches where their voices can be heard and their deeper needs can be honored. So these are the steps to romancing the shadow. It was really astonishing to me when I discovered that each shadow character has repetitive cues every time it appears. Each shadow character has the same inner dialogue or thoughts, the same feelings, and the same physical sensations in the body every time it emerges. And so when you feel centered and grounded, you can begin to identify these cues, to notice your repetitive thoughts or inner dialogue with self-observation. I'll never succeed. I'm too XYZ, or I need to get high, or I'll do it tomorrow. And each thought comes with repetitive feelings, the same feelings every time. Fear, guilt, sadness, abandonment, anger, and repetitive bodily sensations. A tight abdomen or tight shoulders, closed throat, a feeling of emptiness, tight neck, numb legs, and so on. So what we do is we begin to personify these three cues. We imagine that these repeating thoughts, feelings, and sensations are an inner figure in us with three dimensions. And we ask ourselves as we personify it, who is it? Who's there? Is it male or female? What is its age? and we give it an image. What does it look like? Who do we see in our mind's eye? Do we see a crying child? Do we see an angry teen? Do we see an old woman? Who do we see? And then we give it a name. Is it the procrastinator, the dutiful daughter, the abandoned child, the fraud, the loser, the workaholic, the critic, the tyrant? And you can begin to see how, as we personify this aspect of the unconscious that was abstract and amorphous before, it begins to take on a life that you can react to and respond to and imagine. Because now you have a figure with thoughts and feelings and sensations, 3 dimensions. And then you give it a name, and then you give it an image. And the next step is really important, because what happens when the shadow figure comes up is that we feel overtaken. You know, Jung called it possession. It just colors our psyche, and we lose our objectivity, our separateness from it. So we begin to address it out loud in order to separate from it, in order to make it an object of awareness. We recognize that this shadow character is not who we are. It's not our deepest spiritual identity, the self or spirit or Buddha nature or Christ nature. It's a shadow character. And when we listen to it and obey it, there are real consequences for us. So we begin to separate from it in our psyches. And then we can romance the shadow character. So I'm going to give you a number of examples. Let's start with this really well-known, popular figure, the inner child, the needy or abandoned inner child. Its early life experience in all of us has a vast influence over the quality of our lives. Our self-esteem, our self-hate, our capacity to feel feelings or our incapacity, our sense of safety or anxiety, our sense of acceptance or rejection, our sense of being seen or invisible, are all rooted in the inner child. And because our parents were not ideally parented themselves, we can likely say that, it's clear that they pass on their own family shadows to us. So a father judges and condemns his son as weak, or a mother criticizes and shames her daughter's body. And those kids internalize the parents' voices and begin to treat themselves that way, pushing the innocent child into the shadow, where it carries feelings of anxiety, loneliness, helplessness, grief, and starvation for nourishment. And then as adults, when we become attached to someone, we're unaware that that needy child still lives in our shadow. And it can be triggered at the slightest hint of abandonment or criticism or anger by our partners. And we blame them, unaware that the wound is within us. So let's romance this shadow character. We start with a few minutes of quieting the mind and centering ourselves. We identify the presence of the needy or abandoned child by 3 cues. Your repeating thoughts may be different than these, but sometimes you say to yourself, I'm alone, no one loved me. If I can find someone, I'll be okay. So you can identify your own repeating thoughts of the inner child and repetitive feelings, despair, helplessness, self-hate, and repeating bodily sensations like a tight belly and shoulders, a feeling of emptiness. And when you recognize a cue, you do your centering and you witness or you observe your internal experience. You give the shadow character an image and a name. The abandoned child, the orphan, the lonely one, little Tommy, little Susie. And then you address it out loud to separate from it. And you recognize that it's not your true self. So you might say, little Susie, I see you're struggling now, and I want to begin to hear what you need. Because I'm an adult and I have all these resources now, and I can begin to give you what my parents couldn't. And I know you're not who I am. So let's begin this dialogue. So here's a self-reflection for you. Please take your paper and pen and jot down the consequences. Actually, no, let me not start there. You're meeting the needy or abandoned inner child. So what are its thoughts, feelings, and sensations? Let's start there, which is not on the slide. Can you identify the thoughts, feelings, and sensations of the inner child? And when your inner child is triggered and you listen to it, what are the consequences? How do you feel about yourself as you obey it? And how do you feel about others? So you're identifying the 3 cues, the inner child. You're identifying the consequences of being possessed by it. And then what are the feelings that follow that? So The next step is tracing back the origins of your inner child. You can trace it back to an earlier time when you felt the same feelings and heard the same inner messages and felt the same bodily reaction. It could have been earlier in your marriage or in college, high school, childhood. See how early you can go to trace the beginning of this inner figure. Did you actually experience or observe emotional or physical abandonment or abuse? And as you uncover the origins of this figure, you'll find that it formed to protect you from something. Each shadow character begins as a protector and then becomes a saboteur. So, what are the valid needs of this inner child? What was it trying to protect? And can you meet those needs today as an adult in relation to your inner child? You can use the 3 cues to excavate your memory and see if you can find the thoughts or feelings or sensations earlier and earlier in your life. So, what does it mean to you to become aware of your inner child as you romance this shadow figure and create a conscious relationship to it? Rather than allowing it to influence you from the unconscious, how would it affect your feelings about others and about yourself if you make a conscious relationship to it and begin to meet the needs of this hidden part of you, yourself? So, Carl Jung wrote this famous statement: when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. Fate can mean many things, but it can mean that it appears in the lives of our children and in the lives of our children's children. So let's take a moment to talk about the transmission of intergenerational shadow in the formation of a needy inner child. And then we'll go to another shadow character. So when unconscious feelings and attitudes are passed on from grandparents to parents to kids, the elders' hidden shadow issues are absorbed by vulnerable young minds and bodies. Like little sponges, kids pick up hatreds, depressions, fears, addictions, even if they're never mentioned aloud. So if a grandfather dismissed his young son when he spoke up and punished him with alone time in a dark room, and that son grows up with an inner child who feels unseen and unheard and abandoned and carries a lot of shame. And then he becomes an adult and marries. And his inner child still has valid needs to be seen and heard. But those needs may be acted out by yelling or demanding or controlling behavior as an unconscious shadow character erupts and sabotages his deeper need for contact. This happened to my client, Paul. He became a father without an awareness of his intergenerational shadow. He felt unseen and unheard by his father, who had been invisible to his own father. And then Paul felt unheard by his wife. And when they had a son, he defaulted to the family pattern, dismissing the boy when he expressed an opinion or raised his voice. He devalued the boy's growing mind and his need to assert himself, and patronized him with words and gestures. Eventually, Paul began to walk out of the room, abandoning his son because the shame of feeling unheard was intolerable. With shadow work, he began to realize that the wound was in him, not being done to him by others. He learned how to work with his inner child and recognize the three cues as it emerged. He gave it the name Little Paul and an image, a boy in a dark room. And he began to separate from it enough until he could observe it. Eventually, he began to listen to its needs and draw on resources in himself. And slowly, Paul fathered little Paul in a new way, with compassion and acceptance. And only then could he parent his own son more consciously. So let's practice with another example, the addict. And you can choose any kind of compulsion that you struggle with. It could be drugs or alcohol, but it also could be love or sex or food, or anything at all. So this is the shadow character that leads us again and again to act out self-destructive tendencies beyond the ego's control. And an addictive relationship will have the same underlying dynamic as substance abuse. When we're in the grip of it, it feels like a vague, amorphous, all-controlling energy, and it saps our will and brings us shame. Maybe you saw your parents use food or drugs or love in addictive ways to stuff their feelings into the shadow and fill their emptiness and avoid intimacy. So you observed this and internalized it in yourself. Or perhaps a parent used food or love to manipulate you, a reward for good behavior or withdrawal for punishment. And so you formed an inner addict, a part of you that craves an object with a fantasy of fulfillment. The wonderful Jungian analyst Marion Woodman wrote about the muffin as an object of longing. So let's romance this shadow character and personify it so that we can bring it into awareness. with the same steps that you learned before. You start with a few minutes of centering practice. Meet the shadow. Identify the presence of the addict by the 3 cues. I need this now. No one cares if I get high. If I eat this, I'll feel better. And the repetitive feelings, despair, self-hate, and the bodily sensations, tight belly, feeling of emptiness. And then you romance the shadow. You recognize one of these cues and you observe your internal experience. You give the shadow character an image and you give it a name. The foodie, the drinker, the party animal, the player, the lover. And you address it out loud to separate from it. I see you, drinker, going for another glass. I recognize you have a deeper need than to drink alcohol. And I recognize that you're not who I am. You're a shadow character. And we can begin to have a dialogue as I separate from you and observe you and learn what you really need. And in this way, you start to recognize that this thought, feeling, or sensation is not who you are. It's not your true self, your essential nature. So here's the next self-reflection. You're meeting the addict. Take a moment and jot down the thoughts, feelings, and sensations that go with your inner addict. It's not on the slide. Take a moment and see if you can find any of the 3 cues. So as you listen to those cues telling you what to do, what are the consequences? How do you feel about yourself? So let's trace back the origins of the addict, the shadow character, to an earlier time in your life when you felt the same feelings and thought the same thoughts and had the same bodily reaction. Did you experience or observe physical or emotional addiction? And what are the valid needs of the inner addict? Please be sure that everybody's muted. Thanks. So how can you today meet the needs of your inner addict? How could you communicate those needs more clearly as an adult? And what would it mean to you to become aware of the inner addict and create a conscious relationship to it? So when I was still in clinical practice, a woman called me for therapy. Sarah said that her boyfriend was unavailable and she needed to figure out what to do about it. Night after night, she waited by the phone for him to call and she ate ice cream. I asked her why she didn't call him. She was too scared to hear what he would say. So she waited and she ate more ice cream and she had gained 10 pounds. I asked her to begin to observe what she was saying to herself during this time. See if she could catch those subtle thoughts. She was telling herself, if I just wait long enough, he'll call. If I just have a little more ice cream, I can wait. I asked what she was feeling with this inner dialogue. Anxious, empty, and scared. And what were the bodily sensations? It was an empty belly and tight shoulders. So I guided Sarah to personify this shadow character and give it a name. She called it the foodie. And give it an image. It was a big open mouth. The foodie always has the same thoughts, feelings, and sensations, and she began to see the pattern and how it led to an addictive behavior that was destructive for her. Eventually, she saw that obeying the foodie was harmful, and I suggested then that she call her boyfriend. She was really frightened of rejection, but she realized that the consequences of obeying the foodie might be worse. When she finally called, he told her he didn't want the relationship, but was too afraid to tell her. And she was devastated. But a few weeks later, she began to feel relief because she knew the truth, and now she could grieve the loss and work on her addictive behavior. We traced back the foodie to her mother, who had had an unfaithful husband and used food to stuff down her feelings. Like her daughter, she was afraid to confront him and hear the truth. So she had modeled this behavior for Sarah, using food as a substitute for love while waiting for an unavailable man. But Sarah could break free now. Even the foodie had a valid emotional need to speak her truth, to be heard, and to be wanted. So now we're going to move, we've sort of focused on intrapsychic shadow. We're going to move into interpersonal shadow work now. What happens when we meet another person with a long bag of shadow characters? A foodie, a wounded child, a tyrant, a distancer, a rebel, a liar. When two people meet and feel a deep connection, their hearts open and so do their imaginations. Through projection, the shadow expels both positive and negative traits by attributing them to other people and disowning them in ourselves. Projection is like shooting an invisible arrow. Each of us carries an archer's quiver on our backs, and every so often, an arrow shoots out. Oh, that person is so stupid. Or that person looks beautiful inside and out. We say something nasty or we fall in love. And in dating, this happens really quickly. The shadow in dating goes in search of its lost traits in an effort to recover the full range of our personality. So our unconscious fantasy image of the other is a composite of parental qualities with which we identify and repressed traits banished into the shadow. When we feel a match, the promise to heal old wounds and feel loved emerges. And that's why we may later dislike the very traits we were drawn to in the first place. Maybe you've noticed that. A partner's sensuality is alluring, but later it seems threatening. A partner's intelligence is attractive, but later it's intimidating. A partner's independence is a draw, but later it feels abandoning. So part of shadow work in relationships is reclaiming our projections and taking back into ourselves whatever we give away to others in this unconscious process. And this is described at length in Romancing the Shadow. That's the focus of that book, is relationships. So let's pause for a moment and ask you some questions. What traits does your partner carry for you that create the unconscious attraction? Can you see that trait in one of your parents? Is your dynamic with a parent being repeated now? And how is your parents' marriage being repeated in yours? So let's look at an example of a couple from my therapy practice. They met each other and they met their shadows. Joel, a 46-year-old screenwriter, was divorced by his wife after a 12-year marriage. Accustomed to intimacy and emotional support, he was surprised at his attraction to Ellen, a stockbroker, who thrived in her autonomy. And during their first 6 months of dating, he pulled her in and she pushed him away. Joel didn't want to face his separateness or develop his independence. He tried to feel safe through fusion with Ellen. And in response, she clung to her separateness, judging his dependency needs as unacceptable. So Joel felt he could never get enough love from Ellen. And she felt smothered until a destructive part of her critically lashed out in an effort to create distance and restore her sense of safety. With shadow work, they discovered their unconscious characters. Joel was acting out the pursuer and she was acting out the distancer. But why? Consciously, Joel wanted more closeness, but in his shadow, he was drawn to her independence, which he had never developed. Consciously, Ellen wanted her autonomy. But in her shadow, she was drawn to Joel's capacity for intimacy, which she had never experienced. I worked with Joel to learn to find a sense of security within himself for the first time. We explored his history, tracing the origins of the pursuer to a fear of abandonment as a neglected child. When he learned meditation and how to quiet his mind, he began to trust that he could nurture himself. He made a few friendships with men, discovered an interest in chess, and no longer panicked when he felt alone. And then, as he reclaimed the abandoned child, he could stop blaming Ellen for his feelings of loneliness. Ellen did her shadow work too. Initially terrified of Joel's pursuit and overwhelmed by his needs, she would retreat into herself to restabilize. She had no experience of setting a boundary through healthy communication, and so she criticized him. "You're too needy for me. Go take care of yourself." She was unconsciously making distance until she learned to speak in I statements. "I need more time alone. I'm overwhelmed. Please give me some space." As she learned to make boundaries more consciously, rather than allowing her shadow to make distance unconsciously, she began to trust herself and allow herself to feel loved. She was even able to need him, uncovering a shadow that was deeply buried in her childhood, her own dependency needs. And just as he learned to observe his rejection of distance, she learned to observe her abrupt rejection of closeness. And together, over the years, they continued to bring more of themselves into awareness and into the relationship. So, who is the shadow character that sabotages your intimacy? What does it say and feel like and sense in your body? Give it a name and an image. Distancer, pursuer, critic, needy one, avoider. Okay, I'm going to pause there as you contemplate this. When does the fear of losing yourself lead you to be distant and withdraw? And when does the fear of abandonment cause you to give up your voice to feel safe? So let's review the steps again. First, you center yourself with deep breathing or meditation to learn to observe your inner experience. Then you meet the shadow. You identify the repetitive thoughts. For Ellen, she was saying, I'm suffocating, I feel trapped. And you identify the feelings. She was overwhelmed and engulfed by his needs, so she felt anxious and scared. And you identify the bodily sensations. She felt her heart race and her hands grow clammy. And all of this led her to run as far and fast as she could to avoid being caught. For Joel, the repetitive thoughts were, I need more from her. If she loved me, she wouldn't run away. The feelings were abandonment and loneliness, and his body felt small and contracted with a tight belly and shoulders. Both Ellen and Joel learned to do a belly breathing practice. They sat in separate rooms and they allowed their minds and bodies to calm down. And from this less agitated state, they began their shadow work. Ellen saw an image. She was running away from someone who chased her, and she named it the distancer. She addressed it out loud. I see you. I'm not you. You're a shadow character trying to get your needs met. She traced the distancer to a recent incident when someone she didn't trust tried to get close to her, and she had the same thoughts and feelings and sensations. And Joel did a similar process. He met the shadow. It was a man pursuing a woman in an endless effort to catch her. He called it the pursuer, and he addressed it out loud. I see you now, pursuer. I'm not you. I'm a shadow character. You are a shadow character trying to get your needs met. And he traced the pursuer to himself as a little boy, always trying to reach his mother and connect with her, and always feeling she was just out of reach and he was alone. So we do the centering, we find the cues, we give it a name and an image, we address it out loud, we trace the origins. So who lives in your shadow in your current relationship? Is it a controller, a depressive, a daydreamer, a rager, a workaholic, a romantic, a codependent giver? How does your partner relate to these characters in you, and how would you like that to change? So for both Joel and Ellen, the shadow characters had valid needs. The distancer had a need for boundaries and separateness. and the pursuer had a need for intimacy and togetherness. Every relationship is a search for a psychic territory that honors opposing needs. And every shadow character is a doorway into a deeper awareness of our conscious and unconscious needs. So who lives in your partner's shadow? A monk, a slut, a free spirit, a tyrant? How do you relate to these characters in him or her? And how do you discourage their expression when they don't fit your image of your partner? So we've explored your individual shadows and your shadow in relationship, and a bit about what's in your partner's shadow. With individual and couple shadow work, we can move toward a shadow marriage in which both partners vow to honor and accept the full entourage of each other's inner world. They enter marriage consciously, vowing to wake up to their own shadow awareness when they're triggered, promising they'll stop blaming and reclaim their projections. This is a marriage in which all parts of ourselves are welcome, and all parts of our partners are seen as mirrors. This is a marriage in which our individuation is primary. It's not easy, but it's deeply gratifying and authentic and intimate. When my husband and I got married 30 years ago, we had been together for 5 years, and we knew each other's shadows. So in the ceremony, our shadow characters made vows to honor and respect one another. And this is the promise of a shadow marriage. There are many promises of shadow work. Here are a few. You can diffuse the negative emotions that erupt in daily life and become accountable for them. You can release the guilt and shame associated with them because you begin to understand what they're really about. You can recognize the projections that color your reactions to others. You can create deeper intimacy through self-knowledge and accountability. You can achieve a more genuine self-acceptance of yourself and others. And you can learn to identify your shadow characters' valid hidden needs and begin to meet them today as an adult. So you may be aware that there's a big resurgence of interest in shadow work now, especially on social media. And as a result, the publishers of my 2 early books both reached out and said they wanted new editions with new writing. So, Meeting the Shadow, which is an anthology of 65 thought leaders, now has been reissued with new writing. And the essays range across every aspect of life, from work and creativity to health and the body to politics and relationships, every arena and it has a number of essays by all kinds of people, all kinds of thought experts on the shadow. So it's a really great introduction and overview of the topic. Romancing the Shadow, which I wrote with Steve Wolf, is focused on how to break unconscious patterns in relationships. And it's an excellent guidebook for couples or for singles who are dating and looking for a more conscious relationship. The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, extends shadow work into midlife and beyond. I think Renee mentioned that. It's full of shadow characters like the inner ageist and the doer and many others that come up as we go through this stage of life and we hit inner obstacles to living consciously. Each chapter explores a different theme of aging and has many, many practices, both psychological and spiritual practices. And it's really about how to do aging as a spiritual practice. Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, the dance of darkness and light in our search for awakening, extends shadow work into religion and spirituality and asks, why do we project the light onto our clergy and our gurus? And how does that set us up to meet the shadow in ourselves and in our teachers? There's been an epidemic of scandals among spiritual teachers in every denomination. And I was able to use depth psychology to explore that and try to understand why that was going on. So, this book is about religious trauma and spiritual disillusionment and how to use shadow work to recover. Okay, I'm going to stop the slides now, and we have lots of time to talk. Great. So those of you who've turned off your video, I would love it if you turn them back on. And I'm very curious about how this was for you. Did you have an insight and uncover a new shadow character? Did you get stuck? What was it like? Comments, questions? And I'm going to look at the chat so we can see if there's anything there.
Thank you so much, Connie. I have to say, wow, for such a wise and heartfelt journey into the shadow this evening. And you've obviously helped us see how what we often hide and avoid may in fact be the doorway to freedom.
Yes.
So yes, I'd like to open the floor now for discussion and any insights or questions. Please don't be shy.
Oh, that's great. So Karen says she could trace back further and the inner child in the attic shadow. That's wonderful. So maybe you can continue to explore what those characters were protecting and what's their valid hidden need that shows up when they emerge. Because as you start to meet that need, they begin to lose their power.
If I could say something about that. I have done exactly what you just said. I see it as an open-ended process, but I'm thinking particularly of the inner child character. I think the other one's a bit more complicated for me still. Um, but yeah, d just the way you guided us through the explorations, I was able to make a connection to, um, for me, a kindergarten experience that
Great.
really, really triggered the inner child that has had a lifelong impact. But I am now, and have been for some years, working with it, but it's still really easily re-triggered. So, thank you for the way you structured the process.
Thank you, Karen. That's lovely. I appreciate it. Madeline, you need to unmute.
On mute.
Hi.
Okay, sorry.
No, you're muted. Unmute. There you
Okay,
go.
Ah,
Yeah.
there you are.
okay. Um, I really appreciate the systematic way, the system, if you like, that you offered, so that um, particular shadow energies or shadow manifestations could be worked with comprehensively. And early on, when you spoke, you talked about how um, I suppose it's not that clear, but like more positive energies, like creativity, spontaneity, liveliness, can also be stuffed into that black bag. And I think it's probably harder to work. I'm trying to imagine working in that systematic way with, say, a repressed or artistic gift that had been put into the shadow. It seems to
Such a
me
good
that it's
question.
slightly different.
Good question. Um, I don't think it's that different, but in the inner work of age, I offer a practice of life review that
Yeah.
includes reviewing the unlived life in the shadow.
Mm.
So you have a practice for looking through the lifespan at what was expressed and what was repressed. You know, we can't live out everything.
Mm.
I mean, I have a friend who's a psychologist who plays music and paints and has kids. I don't know how he does it all, but we're bound to leave some of our gifts unexpressed, right? And yet we may in later life want to begin to reclaim them, want to begin to reclaim some of those dreams and talents and fantasies. That happens quite often to people in a midlife crisis too. It's
Mm.
often what it's about. So you can begin to use self-observation to watch your fantasies about how you spend your time, where you put your attention. You might have the thought, I wish I could play music today or paint. And then, but you don't notice it. It just goes by. And as you start to notice these deeper fantasies or daydreams or sleep dreams that can come up
Mm.
in your dreams too, as you begin to really practice self-observation, you'll notice what's coming up from the unconscious. And in fact, Madeline, I have a free webinar posted on my website, conniezweig.com, on
Mhm.
creativity and shadow work. So
Oh,
if this is an interest for you, that's a great place to go. There's lots of videos on there, but you can find the one on opening the portal to the creative unconscious and how to use shadow work for creativity because it's so crucial for finding peace
yeah.
and not dying with regret, you know, which is a really big desire in later life. I'm 76. So you know, the wish to live out whatever I can and give my gifts as much as I can is really urgent for me. And if you're feeling that in any way, even if it's not with urgency, even if it's just a fleeting thought, um, I have a little story for you. My literary agent who sold my early books retired from her business and didn't know what she was going to do. And she started painting. And she had never thought about painting. And she fell in love with watercolor and oil painting and did that full time and said to me, I never knew I was an artist.
Mm,
I never even knew I had this wish.
mm,
So I think that you can uncover these dreams and desires and lost talents because every family necessarily represses some of this material in
yeah.
us and it becomes the unlived life, right? And it's much better to kind of begin to excavate it than let it erupt and destroy your life, like happens in midlife sometimes with people who have regret. So they burn down their marriage and they burn down their business and they just get this fantasy that they're going to start over and they don't know how to do it consciously. So thank you for that question. I didn't focus on it in this workshop, but it's really important.
Thank
I'm gonna come to Joyce in a minute. Let's see what's in the chat. Um, yes, if you're working with clients, if there are clinicians here and people who are ill, yes. So there's a whole chapter on how to do shadow work with illness and as a caregiver in the inner work of age. And I think that um, there's a lot of opportunity for psychological development and shadow work in these crises of later life. And I'm hoping that this practice can be really helpful for you with clients as well. Ali in Tehran, oh my God, thank you for that. Meeting the Shadow went into Persian. It's in Farsi. Oh, how fabulous. I'm so glad to know that, Ali. That's wonderful. Okay, Joyce, hi.
Hey, thank you very much for your beautiful lecture, and it was also so clear. Thank you. Uh, and I had 2 weeks ago, I had a dream. I was changing the train and had a lot of luggage, and I lost most luggage. I lost, and I tried to gather them again, and I got also help with that. It was a huge pile of luggage. And then afterwards, I tried to make a long list of my obsessions and tried to, some of them I could place a bit together and so on, all the kinds of obsessions. But
Are you saying obsessions or possessions?
uh, ob uh, obsessions. Uh,
Okay.
uh, for if one is how do you call
Okay.
it? Yeah, and well, but I know them. They are not new to me. Do you think those luggages were all kinds of shadow?
Well, I don't know your psychology, and I'm reluctant to interpret dreams in a sort of generic way, right? I mean, if we were to risk that, clearly the term baggage has several meanings in English. It's means suitcases, but it also means like Robert Bly's meaning, the baggage that we carry with us. So I think it's for you to try to interpret, is that what the dream is telling you? Is it time to lose or let go of your baggage? And certainly, you're in the stage of life that I'm in where it's time to kind of declutter and simplify and let go. So you could interpret it on that level, but you could also interpret it. I'm not sure where you went from baggage to obsessions. That's why I thought you said possessions. But maybe the obsessions are the internal baggage that you've been carrying around that you can begin to release now. I mean, that sounds to me like what the dream is telling you. If I risk, you know, trying to do this in a sort of generalized way.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you also very much.
I'm thrilled that there are people from so many countries here. I think in our cultural moment, which is so dangerous and scary in so many ways, that when you begin to get the frame of shadow projection, you can begin to see how political leaders are weaponizing shadow projection in many countries. And I don't need to name names because you all know. And that as that happens, as they weaponize shadow projection and engage in enemy making, sometimes, archaic enemy making that's gone on for millennia, you begin to have a more depth psychological framework on politics. And it seems to me that we each have a social and political responsibility today to do our own shadow work and not add to that darkness that's very dense right now. And to add our light and our insight, our empathy and compassion, even to people we disagree with, and to begin to try to understand them. And it doesn't mean we change our values or give up, who we are, but we don't want to add our own shadow projections now to what's going on all over the world. We really, and so I think, and in some ways, this has been true throughout human history, there have always been wars and holocausts and genocide and slavery. But it feels particularly dangerous to me right now in my lifetime. And I think in that way, I've spent a lot of this year teaching people to do shadow work as a political responsibility. And I hope, if that resonates with you, I hope that you take that home with you and really contemplate it. Judy.
Yes, could you say something about the shadow work of people who grow up during a war? Because I was born just before the Second World War, and I'm very aware of its damaging effect on lots of my contemporaries. One repressed all sorts of things so as not to rock one's parents' boat because they were so preoccupied with other things. And I was really very upset reading about the eruption of war in Ukraine and people fleeing from their homes and children, the thought of the damaged children. Perhaps you could just say something about that.
Yes, my grandmother was from Odessa. So, the little slide on intergenerational shadow material was the beginning of a conversation about the transmission of trauma across generations. And if any of you are clinicians who've worked with Holocaust survivors, even when it isn't talked about, it's there. It's in the body. It's in the body mind, right? That trauma from generations. And so, Jung spoke about the many levels of shadow. There's the personal shadow and the family shadow and the cultural shadow, the collective shadow, which he spoke about as the objective shadow. And they're almost like, nested Russian dolls inside of each other, all these levels of shadow. And they're all influencing us. They create the field of the collective unconscious in which we swim. And so in each family, there's a little pool of collective unconscious in which we're all participating consciously or not consciously. There's so much good work being done on trauma now. You know, Don Kalshed in the Jungian community, Thomas Hubble, many, many practitioners who are working with trauma. That hasn't been my language and my orientation or my training. But I think, this is a time in which everyone is being traumatized. Just reading the headlines is traumatic. And part of what we need to do with our own self-care is you practice self-observation to notice, is this stressing me out too much? Is this generating cortisol and inflammation for me? When do I stop? Like, I've stopped watching the news. I read the New York Times, but I've stopped watching. And I do long meditations every day to let go of everything. What works for you for your self-care in terms of food and exercise, sleep and meditation and shadow work? And what kind of combination dream work works for you to manage your health and work with the trauma that's happening all around us right now? Ali, yes, Don Kalshed, that was his focus. So it's 12:30 here. I'm happy to take one more comment or question if you like, and then I'll close with you.
Perhaps there's a question in the chat about our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. And it's a quote by Marianne Williamson. And the person would like, could you please say anything more about why would our light and power go into the shadow?
Yeah, that is the whole theme of meeting the shadow on the spiritual path. Because I spent decades really examining how we project the darkness. And as a meditation teacher and a spiritual practitioner, I needed to look at how we project the light. Why do we give away our spiritual authority, our wisdom, our compassion, and say, he carries it for me, she carries it for me? Why does that happen? And what are the consequences of that? What are the consequences for me if I give away my innate power and my spiritual light? And what are the consequences for the receiver of the projection? There are gurus in India, there are clergy in Christianity who carry the projection of millions of people. Imagine the weight of that. And so in some ways, it's not surprising that their shadows act out. Power, sex, money, shadows. Those are the three main areas. So, the fear of our own light, of our own power, of our own spirit, I think is ubiquitous in humanity. And then the people who begin to identify with that become inflated, right? If you identify with your own spiritual light and your shadow is not in a good relationship with your ego, then you become inflated. And we see this grandiosity everywhere with people who believe they should have all the power. So I don't have all the answers, but I really did a deep dive into that. It's what my PhD dissertation was about. And so if that's your particular passion, I would recommend meeting the shadow on the spiritual path. And it came out of my own disillusionment with the early meditation movement that I belonged to in my 20s. And that heartbreak stayed with me for a very long time. Okay, this was wide-ranging and rich. Oh, there's one more question here. Thank you. Yes. Thank you, everyone. Renee, thank you so much for having me. What a great group. Thank you all for coming.
Tremendous.
An
Thank you
absolute
very much.
pleasure. And I want to extend our heartfelt thanks to you, Connie, for sharing your insights and very personal insights as well, and your wisdom to us, with us this evening. And I suspect some of us may be meeting some shadows over breakfast tomorrow, or bumping into them over the weekend errands. But thanks to you, we'll be able to recognize them a little bit more and smile, and maybe even invite them to sit down to tea. So,
So you can find me. I'm doing live streaming on my Substack, which is called Shadow Work Awareness. And you can
fantastic.
find lots of videos on connieswag.com that are conferences and interviews and all kinds of things. And I hope that you continue your shadow work even at breakfast tomorrow.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Connie. Take
Thank you.
care.
Goodbye, and thank you
Thank
all.
you, Connie.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this talk. Thank you for listening. For past and future events, please check out our website,